Good afternoon. Welcome to CHTA Live, the Resilience Series, bringing you practical content to support immediate strategies you need to consider now to endure the crisis. Thank you for taking time to join us. My name is Vanessa Ledesma, Chief Operations Officer for the Caribbean Hotel and Tourism Association. Our topic today is debt restructuring, planning now for long-term survival. Before we proceed with the session, let's go over a few housekeeping items. All participants have been muted. You are encouraged to submit your questions for the panelists during the webinar by submitting them via the Q&A chat box at the bottom of the screen. Questions will be addressed at the end of the session. If you have any additional support questions, concerns, or you wish to communicate between attendees, this can be addressed via the chat box. If you miss anything during our discussion, do not worry. We will be sharing the on-demand video recording within 24 to 48 hours of the webinar. We invite you to join the discussion in our social platforms, share your comments and takeaways using the hashtag CHTA Live. Let's welcome Frank Comito, CHTA CEO and Director General, who will introduce our moderator and panelists. Frank?
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the second in our resiliency series of webinars. We hope you'll find this very informative. The industry has many challenges right now, but money is going to end up being the biggest challenge in terms of cash flow, in terms of immediate cash flow needs, as well as long-term needs. So today we're going to explore those considerations in terms of when considering debt restructuring, which many of our hotels will need to do. It's been said that as many as 70% of the Caribbean hotels are holding some form of debt, with cash having really come to a halt, basically. There's going to have to be some real serious considerations as to, for many of them, as to how they restructure in order to survive and come out of this situation. So we've got a great lineup of folks with us today. We're going to start with our moderator and panelist, hotel panelist, Sanovnik Destang. Sanovnik's a member of the board of directors for the Caribbean Hotel and Tourism Association, past president of the St. Lucia Hotel and Tourism Association, and is part of a family-owned group of family-owned hotels in St. Lucia. So, Sanovnik, from your perspective, what are these challenges and considerations that you're having to grapple with right now as a hotelier, an independent hotelier in particular, as you look at what your immediate situation is and you look to the future?
Okay, thank you for that introduction, Frank, and thank you to everyone who's joined in. It's really an unprecedented situation. I came into the family business in 2008 thinking that I had pretty much seen everything with the recession that we had at the time. But what we're seeing now is really at an unprecedented level with COVID-19. One of the things that's very different from COVID-19 compared to other recessions that we've seen in the past and other slowdowns such as 9/11 is that the travel bans are like something that we've never seen before. And when you look at the fact that we have very limited populations in the local populations in the Caribbean, it's not like China where you're starting to see a bit of a rebound in demand and you could potentially rely on local traffic and staycations. Even in the best markets, that might not even account for 10% of your occupancy. So we're all going to be looking at low to 0% occupancy for many, many months in the Caribbean, in many parts of the Caribbean, partly because of the travel bans and also because of reductions in demand and supply of actual airlift. And my immediate concern and our immediate concern at Bay Gardens, believe it or not, was not the bank so much, because we have had a good long-term relationship with our bank and we've been through these storms with them before. But my first concern actually was my employees and how we could cushion the impact on them. And what we decided to do was to at least cover them as best as we can up until the end of April. But we do have concerns thereafter. And we used a bit of our reserves from the winter to help. And I know we're not the only hotel. There are quite a few hotels who did a lot of things to help out their employees. But once we had figured out what we could do for our employees to cushion the blow for them, the next focus for us really was to figure out what we could do about our operating costs and our operating cash flows. A lot of suppliers were very good to us. Some even reached out to freeze advertising and to suspend, or defer payments. But the first call that I personally placed was actually to our bank, who we've been with for 25 years, and to figure out what we could do about a moratorium. Now, what you're seeing around the Caribbean is that almost all of the banks are giving those 6-month moratoriums or 3 to 6 month moratoriums. Some of them are doing it almost without hesitation, without you even necessarily having to ask. It's almost automatic, both for consumers and for businesses. And really for us, the focus over the next 6 to 9 months is really to just stay alive, because the recovery is going to come. It's just going to take a little bit more time, and you really want to make sure that you're there and that you're part of the recovery when it comes. Definitely a deferral of interest and principal is important. The last time we did this, I believe we may have only asked for deferment of principal, and we're paying the interest. But this is unprecedented. After 9/11, your occupancy went down. Now it's gone down to 0%, and you've got absolutely no business and no cash flow coming in. One thing that you do have to point out, and those who may not be aware, that the interest, of course, will continue to accrue during the moratorium period, whether it's 3 months, 6 months, or 9 months. And you have to be aware of that and find out from the bank what their plan is with regards to that interest. Some of them will want to capitalize the interest that is added to the principal balance, which would possibly mean when you come out of the moratorium period, having a larger monthly or quarterly repayment, which you ideally don't want from a cash flow standpoint. The better option, of course, is for them to potentially extend the repayment term. So you definitely want to find out from them what exactly they're going to be doing with the interest that accrues over that period of time. And I'm saying a lot of what I'm saying, by the way, are things that we're still working on. So I don't want anyone to think that we have all the answers. We're still working out some of these things as we go. But one of the things we're working on right now is a 6 to 9 month cash flow that we need to look at for the rest of this year to determine what our financing needs will be, because this recovery is going to take a long time. I can't stress that enough. I mean, if we're wrong, then that's great, but it is going to take a while for things to go back to normal. And it's important that when you're preparing that forecast, that you don't do it like your typical operating income-based forecast. You have to really think of cash flow at this point. Cash is going to be king. You have to think of things like your working capital. When you start up operations again, you're going to need working capital to invest in food and beverage and supplies inventory. You're going to have to talk about collecting your receivables. You may have gotten a deferral of payment plan or a deferral of expenditures from certain suppliers. You're now going to have to start financing, those, not financing, but servicing those debts to those suppliers. So it's very important that you focus on the cash flow over your next 6 to 9 months to figure out whether you may in fact need additional financing or whether you have sufficient reserves, whether it could be equity from the owners. You have to make sure that you spend the downtime now to figure these things out, because the moratorium of 6 months may in fact not be quite long enough. And the reason I'm saying that is because I don't think it's sensible to necessarily expect that when the flights start coming back, that it will be at the same level that it was before. We don't know what the airlines are going through, but we know it's very difficult for them. And you might find a situation in the medium to long term where some of these flights just can't come back because the airlines either cut their routes or are just not able to fly at all. And that is a very real scenario that you have to look at, and you have to look at where your major sources of business are and how would a failure of any of the major airlines or even regional airlines, God forbid, like Liat or Caribbean Airlines, how would that impact some of us in the region? You may also have a situation where consumer demand is depressed for a while. While it seems that most people are in fact going to be traveling in the next year or so, a lot of people seem to want to travel and defer their vacation. Some just may not be able to because their economies and their source markets are impacted. So you might find that you have lower ADR, low ancillary revenue, low of meetings and food and beverage and spa We don't know how far social distancing will impact us and for how long. Almost every meeting that I certainly was due to attend in the next 6 months has been postponed. And I'm not sure how that was going to impact, because a lot of us in the hospitality industry rely on meetings and incentives business as a very strong ancillary source of revenue. You may also have higher operating costs in cleaning costs because people are going to be very concerned about cleanliness when they do start traveling again. And what I think you need to do is use this time now, because it's a little bit downtime and probably not as busy as we're used to being, unfortunately. So use the downtime to do a 2021 income and cash flow projection, because what it will probably show you is that your current levels of debt service may be tough to continue going forward. And that should allow you to have a discussion with your bank about restructuring your debt, right? Because you can't assume that if you're paying, let's say, $50,000 a month to service your debt now, that you'll be able to continue servicing at that level, because you're going to have reduced revenues and potentially increased costs. And when it comes to having that discussion, it's good to have it early. I don't know if you'd want to have it right away. You probably want to at least secure a moratorium from them initially, but you want to really make a good business case for why you would need a restructuring, either in the form of a longer term or lower interest rate if possible, for the survival of your business and hence the survival of the loan, because the banks don't want to see you fail either. And there are some slides here where I gave some rationale both for and against recommending lower interest rates or negotiating lower interest rates with the banks. It's a ticklish one, and I've had a discussion with a few bankers about this, where they see interest rates going, because quite a few banks in the ECCB, I think I have a typo where it says TNR, I meant TNT Central Bank, Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica, quite a few of the central banks regionally and internationally have in fact reduced their interest rates in response to COVID-19. The ECCB just reduced their repo rate, or discount rate, I think, from 6.5% to 2%. So it's worth having the discussion as to how much that impacts the lending rates for the banks. They would probably push back and say that if you're restructuring your debt, it means that you're at a higher risk now. So hence that would necessitate a higher interest rate. You do have to bear in mind that the banks are going to be under pressure, because virtually all the banks here in St. Lucia have given 3 to 6 month moratoriums to a number of businesses and individuals. So they're going to be 6 months or so with substantially reduced cash flow as well. So that is going to put a lot of pressure on them. And there is also the argument that the central bank rates don't have necessarily as much of an impact on lending rates as much as, say, the cost of the minimum cost of savings rates, which exist in many countries and is a bit higher than you'd find in the United States and Canada. I know here in the ECCB, the minimum lending rate is 2%. So that puts a bit of pressure on them in terms of what they're able to do as well. So I think it's very important that when you have this discussion with the bank about restructuring your debt, that you be very open with them, that you do that forecast, you make it realistic and showcase to them based on the data what you're seeing and what you expect. Use that time to project what your financing gap may be for the short term, what you can really sustain as a debt load going forward. And remember as well that the banks, we're all in this together, and I know you've been hearing that a lot, but it really is the truth that we're all in it together, and the banks are going to be hurting as well. So we definitely need to understand their end of it as well, have a frank discussion with them, and understand that they are also under pressure as well, but it certainly is not in their interest to have any of their clients fail, because of course that would have an impact on their balance sheet as well. And I just put a last little point here. Don't forget your employees. When we come out of when we get into this recovery period and when we come out on the other end of this, they're going to be very critical to us. And while we're thinking about our own financial assistance and debt restructuring, we mustn't forget that they also are going to need debt restructuring, a lot of them for their own personal debt. So I made sure to use some of the time that I spent with my bankers asking about that for them, not on an individual basis, but just on trying to understand what they have in place, because they're going to be under quite a bit of pressure as well. So that's all from me in terms of slides. I know other people have some great contributions to make. And I think right after Frank, you have Mr. Justin Ram, who's going to make a few comments.
Yes, we're going to go right to Justin. We got a kind of on-the-ground view from you and Dr. Justin Ram is Chief Economist for Caribbean Development Bank. They have their ear to the ground on many aspects of both what's going on with central banks throughout the region as well as commercial banks. So, Dr. Ram, to you.
Hey, thanks. Thank you very much, Frank. And it's a great pleasure to be here. And just to also back up with what Sanovnik just said about cash flow being king at the moment, I couldn't agree more with that. And maybe just to make the point that, as Sanovnik was saying, that you have to now look at your strategy differently. And so what you have to bear in mind is that you don't allow the usual culture within businesses to now eat your strategy for breakfast. So that's going to be critical. And so what I plan to do here is just to give you a quick overview of what's going on in the Caribbean economic context. I prepared a few slides. Some of them I'm just going to skim over. But before I get into the real meat of the policy responses within countries, and I'll speak a bit about the financial sector as well, I just want to remind the audience about where the Caribbean was even before the COVID-19 pandemic. As you can see here from this slide, which really is always my ground zero slide, to show that GDP per capita for most of the last 2 decades in the Caribbean, on average, it was above the global average. But somewhere around 2016, it has now dipped below the global average, which suggests to us that some things are not right. And I'm just going to share some of that information with you now. This slide really speaks to some of the challenges that we know that we have in the Caribbean, many of them macroeconomic, productivity and competitiveness. Of course, as the hoteliers on this call and the private sector members on this call would all know how difficult at times it can be to do business in the Caribbean. Human development challenges remain, and as we all know, the environmental challenges. And just, I have to say that as we are going through this pandemic, we have to be cognizant that on June the 1st, the hurricane season begins here in the Caribbean. So while we're dealing with this immediate challenge, we have to remember that we have another challenge looming quite large. And from all accounts, the forecast suggests that we're going to have quite a severe hurricane season this year. So we need to put things in place to manage that. And we also have an implementation gap and a regional approach gap. Now, one of the reasons why our economies have not been doing well was because we had significantly high debt levels at the macroeconomic level, at the government level. Some governments have begun to work on this and to reduce their debt to GDP ratios. Some have been going in the wrong direction, but generally, on average, the median debt levels declined from about 62.7% in 2018 down to about 62%. And we've been having this decline over the last few years. That's good, but we still need to bring these numbers down. However, now with the pandemic, we're likely to see these numbers rise as governments try to intervene to support their economies initially. And this, of course, I mentioned before, these challenges because we live in this very bad neighborhood where we have these visitors who we give names to every year. So, for example, as we know, in 2017, we felt the effects most certainly of Hurricanes Irma and Maria. And last year, of course, our brothers and sisters in the Bahamas felt quite significantly the impacts of Hurricane Dorian there. So just to remind the audience that we have to pay attention to this. At the global level, I don't need to go into this. We all know that stocks have dived, but just to reiterate what Sanovnik was saying in terms of there's a serious decline in working hours across the world. And this means that there's a lot of unemployment. And this means that it's going to take some time for employment to get back up to the pre-COVID-19. And that's probably going to take maybe over a year to do. So we expect to see a slowdown in demand for quite some time. And in addition to that, I was looking at some data which looked at the percentage of Americans who feel that the pandemic has reduced their family income, and this is by earning category. And as you can see, that quite a significant percentage across all income groups feel that they have been significantly impacted, or certainly been impacted to some extent. And so this means that people are starting to feel less wealthy. And of course, when people start to feel less wealthy, they don't want to spend as much on discretionary items, for which, of course, for some persons, leisure and holidays are considered to be discretionary. So let's look at the implications of COVID-19. As you know, in the Caribbean, most of our countries are quite heavily dependent on tourism. And this chart, this table just gives you an idea of the impacts and the contribution to GDP across the Caribbean that tourism plays. Now, as we know, we're going through this. The priority now is, of course, to flatten the health pandemic curve. But that means that while we do this, we expect to see a contraction in our economies. And so this is really our focus here. How deep and for how long the recession is going to be will depend on the accompanying macroeconomic measures. And later on, I'm just going to say a little bit about what those measures could be, and I'll specifically hone into the private sector and financial sectors. And this is just giving you an idea as to what's happening in the economy. Generally, our economies were probably operating at an equilibrium rate at about E1 on this chart, but with demand and supply falling, it's likely that output has now fallen from Y1 to Y2. And that is also going to lead to a significant impact on the overall prices within the economy. Now, remember, when prices drop within an economy, it does not really provide a great incentive to suppliers to start producing more. So we have to pay particular attention to what policymakers can do to ensure that prices are going in the right direction. A little bit of inflation is always good. We don't want to be in a situation where we're in a deflationary spiral. So just to remind you that there's a real multiplier effect of tourism, direct and indirect, and there are significant linkages between the tourism sector and other sectors. And although I have not explicitly indicated it here, but there's a real link between the tourism sector and the health of the financial sector, the topic of our discussion this afternoon. This is just some impacts on tourism. I'm just going to skip through some of these slides because these slides will be shared with you, the audience, later on. But just to say that we have done some scenarios where we have looked at a low case scenario as to whether there could be a 50% decline in tourism over the next 6 months. There's a moderate scenario of 80%, and then a high risk scenario of 100% decline over the next 6 months. And we've worked out for most of our borrowing member countries what that would mean for GDP, for debt to GDP, and for government's fiscal balances, so that they have an idea as to what they can do in order to support their economies. I can speak about those during the discussion. But here are some of from our results, the real economic indicators are likely to be a decline in economic growth, decline in revenues, liquidity to suffer, government expenditures to increase, but that means that public debt is likely to increase. Social indicators not going in the right direction, unemployment. We have to be mindful because we know that with this pandemic, there is going to be a rise in mortality rates directly from the virus, but then also as it relates to other things as well. Poverty rates are likely to increase and social exclusion, and we have to be mindful of the access to healthcare at this time. So let me just speak a little bit about policy responses. I've worked up this schematic here that it's important that while we try to flatten the pandemic curve, we implement policies to try to reduce the contraction in the economy. That means I'm calling this the economic triage state. But certainly, once we start to get back to some normality, we need to take some time to assess the structural damage to the economies associated with the pandemic. And from there on, I think the phase 2 needs to kick in, whereby we now start to think about how we resuscitate and rebuild and build resilience into our economies. I'm happy to discuss that as well. But let me just get straight into some of the policy options in the economic triage stage of this recovery. Our first priority must be health system support in the Caribbean and across the world. Ensure that health systems are properly resourced with both human resources and financial resources as well as the required equipment for them to do their jobs effectively at this time. Social system support is very important because, as I said, there's likely to be a number of people going into, could be on the cusp of actually going into poverty. And what support we put in place now is going to be very critical for how these individuals are going to come out on the other end. Fiscal and financial prudence, I just need to remind our audience that our governments do have a considerable constraint as to the amount of support that they can provide to the economies. That means that when you look at it, they can't simply go out and spend as much as other, the more developed countries can do, because we have a significant foreign exchange constraint. So it is very important that any fiscal stimulus that is done in our countries has as an anchor sufficient foreign exchange reserves as a buffer at all times. Labor market support, as we know, governments are coming in to try to support to some extent lost incomes. That's going to be important. But let me just focus a little bit on the private sector and financial sector support. As Sanovnik says, as the private sector seeks to get moratoriums from the financial sector at this time, and that I think is only prudent and wise, we also have to be mindful of the health of the financial sector. What's important is that we want everyone to come out of this crisis on the other end with an opportunity to survive in the long term. And that includes the financial sector. So as we seek to perhaps think about how you speak with your financial intermediaries about how you might want to restructure your debt, pay particular attention to that. Because there's a really important point here that if you are going to be paying your loans off later on, so you're extending the tenor of your loan, then the net present value receipts for the banking sector declines. And that means that your asset, your loan is always an asset to the bank. That asset now falls in value. And that means that the bank's balance sheet will take a hit. So we have to be mindful of this. Our regulator is now going to say to the banks, perhaps we also give you some forbearance on the regulatory requirements. For example, what is the minimum amount of capital that banks need to be holding at this time? The reason why I'm saying this, because this is also an important part of the overall conversation where we're speaking about why everyone needs to be a part of this solution. And where we speak about the private sector and financial sector support, we have to ensure that the regulator and government is also on board with this so that all parties can come out of this in the best possible health. And then my seventh point here on policy responses is really to think about how we now get greater regional integration. Can we have greater levels of purchasing across the region? Because let me just explain this to you. Every time a government in the Caribbean spends $1 to do fiscal stimulus, a significant amount or proportion of that dollar, maybe over 80% of it, goes on imports. And that means what we call the fiscal multiplier is quite small in the Caribbean because a lot of the benefits are being felt outside. We need to find some way to boost the size of that fiscal multiplier. And one of the ways to do that is to do what I'm calling here the import substitution. Can we get greater levels of purchasing, not only within the national countries, but then regionally? And then, of course, that brings up a whole set of other discussion points about why have we not moved forward further along the integration process in the region? I think now is the time that we need to put that squarely back on the table. Now, finally, as we come out of the pandemic, this is just a slide which shows you the things that I think our countries are going to have to focus on when we think about how we build resilience and to how we resuscitate our economies. So Frank, I just want to leave it there. I'll stop sharing my screen now. We can discuss these points later on in the webinar.
Very good. Thank you, Justin. And keep in mind, if you have any questions, you can post them on the Q&A section here, on the chat section, and we'll pick up on that. We will have some time in a little bit to share our thoughts that way. Let's get back down into the ground. That macro perspective was incredibly helpful, but let's get back and look at the ground, okay, from a debt restructuring point of view. What are the kinds of things you need to plan for now? Matt Norton is an attorney with specialty in real estate, particularly focused on resorts with K&L Gates out of Charleston, has extensive work in the Caribbean. Matt, you're going to give us some practical advice on some of the things that people need to be doing right now to set the stage for some of the types of debt restructuring or refinancing that they may have to do. Matt?
Okay, great. Thanks, Frank. Yeah, what I'd like to talk about today is really what, as a hotel owner, you can do right now in preparation for dealing with your lender. And so there's 6 points I'd like to talk about. First of all, just having a really thorough review of your legal documents and analysis of that. The second thing is doing the same thing with your insurance policies. The third step is to monitor the regulatory environment and whatever governmental action is happening in your jurisdiction and in the jurisdictions affecting your property. The fourth is to make sure you're communicating well with all of your stakeholders and you're increasing your reporting. The fifth is to prepare a very professional and organized impact plan, or I like to call it a lender book, so that when you sit down with your lender, you really have all the information that that lender is going to want to see for starting to evaluate how to best deal with your loan. And then finally, I'm going to discuss some considerations to discuss with your lender. It's not moving on my screen. Is that moving, Frank?
No, I don't see it moving. Alexis, you want to take a look at that real quick?
Let's see.
Hi, Matt. Try to just exit out and reopen, or click next with your arrow. Yeah, so we see your PowerPoint right there. We just do from the beginning.
Okay. Is it better now?
Yep.
All right. So in terms of reviewing all your relevant documents and analyzing your rights, the first thing, go through all of your loan documents, and that would include your collateral documents, your mortgage, if you have a debenture, guarantees, everything. Like same thing with your hotel documents. If you have a hotel management agreement or a franchise agreement, make sure you know what's in there. Your technical service agreements if you're under construction, and then your SNDAs and comfort letters if you have those things with the lender and you've got a hotel brand. And I would advise that have someone on your staff go through them first, and then get your lawyer involved just to try to cut expenses down a little bit. Same thing with all your equity investor documents, your joint venture documents, and any kind of, if you have any, depending on how many people are in your equity group. Likewise, any agreements that you have with government, development agreements, MOUs, MOAs, concession agreements, whatever they're called in your jurisdiction. And then finally, really look at all of your relevant agreements. You might have golf usage rights, park agreements, whatever it is. Look at all of them. And the kinds of things you're going to want to pay particular attention to are a force majeure provision. Sometimes it's called extraordinary events in the hotel documents. Sometimes a variation on it is a MAC clause or a material adverse event clause. But basically, it's a provision that's commonly found in all of these contracts. It allows a party to suspend performance because of an event that has occurred that's out of the control of the parties. And it's typically things that are called acts of God, like storms and government restrictions, strikes, natural disasters, material shortages, epidemics, pandemics, those kinds of things. And it can be a very, very powerful clause if you have it. And most of these documents will have something like that in it. Typically, though, they're construed quite narrowly depending on your jurisdiction. And also, typically, they don't necessarily give you relief, or they're not applicable to monetary obligations. like payment of principal and interest or lease payments if you have a lease, or even hotel fees. But instead, they are applicable to other kinds of dates and milestones like construction obligations and those kinds of things. So they still can be very, very powerful. And you really need to understand what your rights are under these legal documents with respect to that. Same thing with, and the reason why typically a force majeure clause excludes monetary obligations is because most of the time your lender is expecting you to have business interruption insurance to cover the gaps that these kinds of, you know, events create. And so that's the second thing really, is to look very seriously at your business interruption insurance. In addition to force majeure, you know, take a look at performance milestones throughout all your documents, look at operational and financial covenants. You know, if you have reserves like interest reserves, CapEx reserves, operating shortfall reserves, construction deficit reserves, FF&E reserves, whatever they are, look and see what's in there, what your obligations are related to them, and be thinking about if you have money in some reserve that may need to be reallocated into operational shortfalls because of what's happening now. You know, that might be part of your discussion with your lender. And likewise, take a look at default and termination provisions and notice requirements, and get a memo together. Get your staff to put a memo together so that you really have at your fingertips what your legal rights are under all of your documents. So in terms of reviewing insurance policies and filing applicable claims, I mean, the most important is clearly business interruption, also called business continuity insurance. And the problem with it that we're seeing is that oftentimes it's actually tied to property loss. So a more typical situation, different than a pandemic, would be a hurricane, and you would have property loss. You have your asset. Here we don't have that. We don't have the same kind of property loss. So unfortunately, what we're seeing in the early going here are insurers denying business interruption claims, even though you're in the same financial situation you would be in if we had a hurricane. You know, we don't have guests in our hotels, and we still have creditors to pay. So, so take a very close look at that. I do think there's going to be a lot of litigation over this, frankly, so I wouldn't give up completely. And the other thing is, you know, have a real professional that understands these things, whether it's your insurance broker or an attorney that specializes in insurance. Look for both provisions in your insurance policies that might support coverage and exclude coverage, specifically for infectious diseases or governmental order closures, which we have both in play here right now. A couple of other types of insurance that you may have and not even know it. There's something called supply chain insurance, and it is what you think it is. It's a contingent form of business interruption insurance, and it helps cover, you know, disruptions from supply chains, particularly with inventory, utilities, even customers, that kind of thing. There's also take a look at your liability policies and make sure that you're covered from a liability standpoint, and that would be not only your company, but your directors and officers. If in fact you do have a guest that becomes infected or, you know, heaven forbid, passes away from this, there could be a lawsuit. You want to make sure you understand your rights vis-a-vis your insurance policies there. Also, event cancellation insurance. I know if you have a hotel that relies on group business, that will be very, very important because everybody basically canceled their events in March for the foreseeable future. And so that there is an insurance that you can buy. It's expensive, but if you have it and you just sort of happen to have it and you've got a good insurance broker, you know, you can take advantage of that. So make sure you really understand what you've got and then thinking ahead, you know, where you need to go really in terms of buying these kinds of riders and baseline insurance. I think both insurance companies and owners are going to take a lot different view of insurance after this pandemic. The next point I want to talk about is just monitoring what's happening with your government, and both the government on your island and also governments of your feeder markets. So if you're predominantly getting your guests from the U.S. or from different countries countries in Europe, make sure you understand what's going on in those markets as well. But, so that would include, you know, travel advisories, stay-at-home advisories, public health department guidelines. Certainly understand any sort of potential government assistance that might be available. As someone previously already said, I'm not sure how much assistance is going to be available in the Caribbean, certainly compared to the U.S. But it's, on the other hand, you know, even the assistance that we're seeing coming out of the U.S. and Europe can be very indirectly beneficial to you as a hotel owner in the Caribbean, because your guests and your investors, there's relief for them, and hopefully you can. That will allow people to start to travel more quickly, and also allow your investors to have some liquidity that they would not have normally had. Also, monitor changing government regulations. A lot of governments are relaxing reporting requirements and general requirements right now for your business. We're seeing a moratorium on foreclosures and evictions throughout the U.S. At the statewide and city level, and I know some of that's starting to see some of that in the region as well, and also any changing governmental regulations that may affect your existing concession agreements. I think, you know, governments are everybody's sort of in this together, as someone said earlier, and I think government's going to be very receptive right now to relaxing some requirements in order for you as a hotel owner to continue, particularly to make payroll and keep as many of your employees on the payroll as possible, and also just to continue your business really too. And there may be some amendments to concession legislation, if there is concession legislation in your jurisdiction, that could be beneficial. So make sure you know what's going on. Also along those lines, make sure that you know your market intel. You know how your lender specifically and how other lenders in your jurisdiction are treating other borrowers similarly situated. That kind of intel can be very, very powerful when you're going in to a negotiation with a lender. Okay, so I think it's really important to do your homework and put a very professional lender book or impact plan together describing the current financial condition of your hotel and its expected performance over the next 6, 9, 12, even 24, 36 months. Obviously, you're going to have to make a lot of assumptions, but that's what the lender is going to do when the lender makes decisions about how to treat your loan. So, make sure you've got really solid and up-to-date hotel operation statements, cash flow statements, balance sheet, CapEx reports, revise your budgets, estimate your ADRs and occupancies and RevPAR based on what you know now. And this is going to be an ongoing process, right? I'm seeing some incredible numbers, 60% reductions in revenue for the year, things like that. I'm seeing projections, not uncommon at all. Frankly, in some ways, the Caribbean's maybe a little bit better off because of the seasonality. And we happen to be going into a slower season now. And hopefully by the time everything starts to really pick back up again, high season will begin in November and toward the end of the year. And so possibly the Caribbean will be spared a little bit in terms of overall revenue loss this year. Make sure you know where all of your loan reserves are. I went through those various reserves earlier, but make sure you know what's there, and revise budgets and be practical and realistic about what you need. And this is going to be a partnership with your lender here. The lender's going to want everything. They're going to want you to refill all your reserves and to find capital to refill those things, and you just may not have it. So you're gonna have to sit down and decide, where are we really gonna put the money here? And obviously, ultimately the lender will probably want an interest reserve and operating shortfall reserve first. Describe your cost saving measures and impact on your business. Describe ways in which you're protecting the underlying value of your asset, making sure that you're paying your taxes and utilities and payroll and insurance and the things that you've got to pay week in and week out in order to keep things rolling and get ready to come back into business when the time comes. Also, describing the status of your ongoing discussions with the brands, for example, the other stakeholders, your investors, and what's happening there. and thinking ahead about the things you're going to need from your lender as well along those lines. I mean, I think most brands are going to want to get an estoppel, for example, from the lender saying that you're not in default or you've worked out your loan before they're going to react, you know, or vice versa. There's going to be a lot of chicken and egg here between your investors and your brand and your lender as to, you know, who's sort of on board with your workout plan, and everybody ultimately needs to be on board. So up front, just get those discussions going and let them know what the various stakeholders are going to need. And then finally, just, you know, make sure you got a really realistic business continuity plan that deals with all of the impacts. And what is your plan to increase your cash flow and return to normal operations? You know, and is there CapEx that can be accelerated? That's another thing. It could very well be you can use this time right now to get some construction done that you weren't going to do maybe until next summer. But if you've got a little bit of cash on hand right now and you can get some things done while no one's at your property, that's not a bad idea either. Lenders are going to really appreciate honest and transparent communication about the actual state of your business and the future prospects for your property and the repayment of their loan. And I think if you go into it with that attitude, you'll do a lot better. And finally, then considerations discussed with your lender. Obviously, payment forbearance and just trying to get that taken care of. I think Sanovnik mentioned 6 months or 3 to 6 months, and I think that's realistic, especially in the Caribbean. You know, assuming the bank can handle that, assuming the bank is strong enough to handle that kind of a moratorium, that kind of forbearance, especially moving into the high season. I think that would be terrific. You know, but it's not just payment forbearance. Look, again, go back to the analysis of your legal documents and look at all of those things that are affected by this impact, whether it's, you know, default interest, late charges, covenants, you know, obligations to obtain licenses and permits, and government offices are closed now. All those things you should have on a tick sheet and say, I need waiver on this, I need deferment on this, I need this and this and this, so that when you're done with your lender, you really have dealt with everything that could possibly arise in those legal documents that could trip you up, let's at least say, to the end of the year. And then my final comment is, don't inadvertently trigger any unwarranted taxes. Stay away from the registrar if you can, with whatever loan modification forbearance documents you finally, kind of definitive documents you put into place here. We don't want to unnecessarily attract stamp tax. And also debt forgiveness, if you can get some of that, could in many jurisdictions trigger a taxable event as well, a cancellation of debt. So make sure your tax professional's working with you also through all of this. That's all I got, Frank. Hey, Frank, your mute's on.
Okay. No, that's plenty. It's very good. Thank you, Matt. This presentation will be shared, so you'll be able to tap into some of the expertise that's being shared. Our next presenter and final presenter, before we get into a little bit of Q&A, is no stranger to facilitating financing and debt restructuring for properties throughout the Caribbean. George Spence with Luxe Capital Americas will give us some of his insights and experiences. Back over to you, George.
Thank you very much, Frank. Let's get our slides up. You see us there?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Very good. Well, thank you, all of you, for joining us today. Certainly, the things that the other participants in this group have said are all excellent, and I've been taking notes, so I appreciate all their comments. And I think the first thing that I'd like to quote again is where Matt said, "Be honest and transparent." That's going to be, people are going to know if you're not telling a straight story, if you're telling the bank something that's not accurate. So tell the truth. So the COVID crisis has moved so fast that the circumstances have dictated that people in the industry have been focused mostly on other things so far. Labor matters have taken up a lot of time over the last few days and weeks. Decisions on how and when to close your hotel and what you're going to do in that respect. Your relationships with your local and international suppliers of food, beverage had to be renegotiated. Your relationships with your clients, tour operators, travel wholesalers, OTAs, canceling conventions, meetings, all of this is taking up a lot of time. And a number of these parties have been requesting return of deposits and prepayments and so forth, relationships with governments. All these have been taking up time. And so the issue of what to do with the banks has been pushed back a bit in the schedule. What has been the behavior of the industry here so far in the Caribbean area? You can see the dramatic decline in occupancy down to 8.4% as calculated by our friends at STR. If we look at prior recoveries from prior processes like this, for example, 9/11, the light purple line is what happened after 9/11, the decline in ADR, that is average daily rate. And then we look at the darker purple line, that is after the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, how long that took. And I want to draw your attention to the fact that if we look at that purple line, it's coming back at about month 54. Month 54, keep that in mind. We have some interesting insights from a firm called Tourism Analytics based out of Aruba, our friend James Heppel, who is there. And he draws our attention to the fact that in 9/11, the impact was on fear, on uncertainty, on willingness to travel, but there wasn't a big economic component right away. In 2008, 2009, on the contrary, there was a very large economic input here in the loss of the value of financial assets, loss in employment, loss in real estate values, job insecurity. And so the 2008, 2009 one was more financial, whereas the other one had been more emotional. But this one, what we're looking at with COVID-19 is a combination. This is quite new. We have the fear and uncertainty on the one hand, and we have the economic losses and the job losses on the other hand. And this is producing very large losses for the airlines and the hotel companies themselves and the cruise industry. Now, everyone would like to see what we call a U-shaped recovery, shaped like the letter U, where we're looking here at occupancy rates on the vertical and on the horizontal number of months that go out. However, if we look at this more carefully, we'll probably find ourselves looking at something that's not a U-shaped, and that the occupancy comes back here, say in month after 2-3 years. This is in that range. And the rate of rate recovery, the ADR rate recovery, will probably take longer, closer to the 40+ months that we saw in after 2008, 2009. So the shape of the curve is very important. In some conversations, when we're talking with our creditors, there may be an underlying assumption that we're looking about at a U-shaped recovery versus what people are calling now the Nike-shaped curve, which is a curve like the Nike logo. And it is our particular view that we're looking at one like the Nike curve. This we got yesterday from the Wall Street Journal, which showed their idea of what happened in the dotted line after 2008, 2009, and what we're looking for in the dark solid line for the current recession in terms of US GDP. And it seems to coincide that these are in quarters. So 10, 11 quarters, 10 months, 10 quarters is like 30 months, 11 months is 33. So you're talking about 3 years here to get back. So from the bank's perspective, there have been some initial discoveries, discussions so far. Some of the banks are trying to put together sort of a program approach, going to their boards and their committees and saying, what are we going to offer the hotels? And they come up with a pretty general sectoral package or terms and conditions. And many of these consider foregoing principal payments for 6 to 9 months, and in some cases, some assistance with interest payments as well. But most of the banks want to collect their interest in a timely manner. And every lending institution is, of course, unique in their approach. What is best for your hotel? Well, if we go with a 6 to 12 month postponement of principal payments, which is assuming a U-shaped recovery, you will probably reach an agreement quite quickly with the banks because this is what they want to hear. Nevertheless, in our view, you will probably have to go back to them again at the end of 2020 or in 2021 and have another restructuring. Whereas if we have a comprehensive type of restructuring, then this assumes the Nike-shaped recovery curve. You would base this upon a long-term projection of your financials that would have your P&L, your profit and loss statement, your cash flow, your assets, liabilities, all of your covenant compliance, be probably a 10-year projection. And you would submit a comprehensive restructuring package, which is analogous to what Matt was calling the lender book. I like that term, lender book. It would be a book. It's not going to be a memo. It's a book. And you would get this done at the depth of the crisis when people are very receptive to this. Now, what are the some of the advantages, disadvantages of the 6 to 12 month postponement versus the other one? The program solution is a program solution. It's not customized to your particular needs. It will use standardized terms that the banks have pre-approved, and the repayment terms may reflect what is the wishful thinking of the bank and not the real situation that your particular hotel is going to be facing. Whereas if you do a comprehensive restructuring based upon research, based upon your lender book, it's going to be a customized solution. The terms are going to be negotiated around your particular needs, your real world conditions, and what you're going to be facing for the relaunching as well. And it should be something you can live with. In terms of our conclusions and recommendations, because most hotel loans are collateralized by a first mortgage and liens on your property, the issue of how to deal with this is really a bet the company situation. You're betting your hotel on this. You have to get it right. You don't want to do something quick and dirty and then face a very uncomfortable situation later on. The depth and length of this COVID-19 crisis, the future for the airlines, for the tour operators, for the consumer behavior, we still do not know. So you must take very conservative assumptions on this. This is not a situation in which you want to improvise. And I would add on to that something that Sanovnik said earlier. Remember, your only situation is not just you and the bank. You have to deal with a number of other things. If you close down your hotel and you want to reopen it, you're going to have pre-opening expenses just like you did when you opened it the first time. You're going to have to hire employees ahead of time. You're going to have to get your team back together. You're going to have to be purchasing inventory. You will have to have been conducting maintenance work for months before this to make sure your rooms do not get musty smelling like you do after a hurricane and so forth. You will incur hundreds of thousands of dollars before opening the doors. And you're also going to have to spend money on sales and marketing. You're going to have to get the word out. We are reopening, and when we are reopening, and this is going to be a very crowded marketplace to get your message out there. So there you're going to have expenses in that regard too. So the preparation of a thorough new business plan and a customized restructuring plan, we believe, is extremely important for this, and we would not recommend going in with a program solution. So we thank you very much for your time on this, and we're turning it back to Frank for questions and answers.
Well, I'm going to turn it actually over to Sanovnik to see what types of questions he may have for his colleagues, and also to look at some of the questions that are out there by our participants. Sanovnik.
Yeah, so I'm actually scouring, and I'm surprised our participants have been very, very quiet so far. There was one question about slides being shared, and I think that Vanessa answered that. You know, one of the things that I didn't quite hear discussed, and I'd like to get an opinion, because a lot of hoteliers and other business people are asking, what are the thoughts in regards to negotiating on interest rates? Under what circumstances would you think it appropriate, and this is to anyone on the panel, would you think it appropriate to have a discussion on interest rates, you know, reducing interest rates with your bank? And how would one go about even making that argument under the circumstances? Anyone want to take that?
So I could probably just come in there. Now, most of my experience has been around debt restructuring at the national level, at the government level. And if I just probably give an example there of what tends to happen when you're doing that, and that also includes if you're trying to get a reduction on coupons as it relates to bonds, but here is now interest rates. The institutions that are supporting that would tend to also want the entity that's doing the restructuring to perhaps follow some conditions, and I'm thinking that this might now be applicable here even for the private sector. So as you sit down with your financial institution and say, okay, I want to get a reduction on interest rates, or I want to get increase the tenor of the loan to stretch it out a bit more. Well, what am I going to be putting in place to ensure that my cash flow is now secure? And I think that it might be useful to go to your bank and say, okay, here are the things that I plan to do. We can have an agreement that I can meet these benchmarks. I can report on these benchmarks ever so often. And that of course is in turn, would you then give me this concession on interest rates, for example, on increasing a tenor? I'm just thinking that might be very useful for us to consider, to look at what happens at the governmental level and to try to see if we could reflect that even at the private sector level. So you have some conditions that you have said that you are going to follow, and you come to an agreement so that the bank also now has some comfort to know that you are putting things in place and that you're reporting back to them about what you're doing. So it's a sort of a give and take. And on your actual question, I think yes, now is a good time to have that discussion. But I think you are in a much better position if you go to your bank and say, okay, here are the things that I'm going to do. Here's my new business plan. And it's not just a business plan for now, it's a working document that I will report on quite often and get back to you on maybe on a quarterly basis.
Okay, so I actually, there were some questions in the group. Sorry about that. Thanks for Vanessa for pointing that out. So in the Q&A, there was a question for me: how does one cash flow forecast for the next 3 to 6 months, let alone 2021? Well, good question. And no one has the correct answer for that. What from my standpoint, and anyone else can jump in there, but I'm basically going to assume the worst, right? And do some sensitivity analysis. But for the next 3 to 6 months, assume close to 0% occupancy. Now, the optimist in me believes that we may be able to do better than that, but I think you have to, because certainly nothing seems likely to open up until end of May into June in terms of flights. So you basically, I think, have to go with a realistic worst case, medium case and best case scenario. You have to make sure whatever template you set up allows you to do sensitivity analysis. But there's no easy answer to that one as to how you forecast. And I would say that whatever you do, have it as something that's a living document that you can revisit, I'd say every fortnight, every month, and adjust it as more information comes to light. Hopefully by May, most of us will have a better idea of what we can expect in terms of flights into our various destinations. I think the flight availability and the load factors on these flights will have a big impact on what our forecasted incoming cash flows will be.
Sanovnik, may I make a comment on that?
Sure.
Yes, that is exactly what we do, those types of projections under very stressed conditions. Yes. And we, unfortunately or unfortunately, had to do a lot of that after 2008, 2009, after 9/11, and after the recession they had in Mexico in 1994, 95, where a lot of hotels were facing similar types of situations. So, yeah, the projections really have to be very detailed. Yes. As you say, they will be living during a period of time, because there will be a period of time in the negotiation. It's not that just you submit this lender book, as Matt called it, to the bank, and that's it. The conversations will go back and forth for some time, and you're going to end up modifying that projection. And so it has to be very robust in its ability to take into account changes that will occur during the course of the negotiation, because the bank is going to want to look at it 5 or 10, 15 different ways. And they're going to challenge you again and again and again, because that's their job. As Dr. Ram said, we need to keep the banks healthy at the same time, because the ability of the banks to react and to serve these communities where we need them for consumers and for a lot of other things will depend in part on their own health and survival. So it's a two-way street, like so many other things. But yes, you can do a very detailed and robust model that can take into account these changes and can take into account the types of situations that we're facing. And we've done that for banks, and we've done that for hotels.
Thank you. There are some other questions on here. Let me just open them up. On the issue of central banks and minimum capitals, has there been any indication from the central banks around the region that there might be relaxing of these requirements? That's something I'm curious about as well. Whether they might be relaxing that, and would they even want to take on the discussion of the minimum lending rates in jurisdictions where that occurs? Because that, from my information, that has a big impact on the minimum saving rate. Because the minimum saving rate seems to have a big impact on the lending rates that banks are able to offer. And I know in the ECCB they reduced it a few years ago. Do you think, Justin perhaps could answer that? Do you think that that's likely that they would be looking at that? Because I know in some places there isn't even a minimum lending rate. Is that something that they would even look at, or would they be too concerned about the consumer impact of same?
Yeah, thanks, Sanovnik. I think certainly for the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank, they have already looked at that. And so that might be an announcement soon, because of course they recognize how important it is to reduce interest rates now. Some of the other central banks around the region that don't have fixed exchange rates, so certainly in Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, they have reduced their reserve requirements in an attempt to reduce lending rates. It's just a matter of whether the banks pass that on and to what extent.
Right.
That's probably have to be looked at to ensure that those savings are then passed on. On your first question around whether there are going to be relaxation of capital requirements and the like, I don't think those discussions have really happened as yet officially. But I'm just putting that out there that might actually have to be something that we look at, even if it comes down to whereby we consider removing the non-performing loans from the banks and perhaps putting them into a special purpose vehicle so that banks are not now constrained by these sort of impaired assets, if you understand what I'm saying. So that means you're now trying to clean up the balance sheet of the banks to make them much more in a position to do new lending. So I think as time goes on, and it depends on how long this crisis continues, we're going to have to look at innovative ways to ensure that banks are also healthy so that they in turn can help their clients. And if that means taking out some of these temporary non-performing loans away from their balance sheets for a while, these are the types of things we might want to consider, the regulators might want to consider doing.
Okay, that's an interesting one. There is a question: how can the region come together to find out which insurance brokers we can activate to get better coverage as a unit? I'm not sure if Frank, you want to take that one. Sounds like something that we could advocate for maybe as a CHTA.
Yeah, I mean, we've sought to do that in the past, and then part of the challenge is there's so many different types of rules and regulations and regulatory bodies in different jurisdictions. But if you go into our resource center, because insurance did come up a bit in Matt's topic and a few other on the comment side of this Q&A. One of our allied members, Smith Orloff, had put together a response and an analysis of policies, particularly on the force majeure area, and to help hoteliers to determine whether or not they actually are covered in that area, because the insurance companies are playing hardball. So take a look at that, and we do intend in the coming weeks to also have a session that will focus on insurance as well. So we'll stay tuned in those areas.
Yeah, travel insurance included, Frank, because I know it's two different types of insurance, but I think that certainly discussions with people like TripMate are in order, because that, you need to get people confident again in booking directly. And I think travel and trip insurance will be a big part of it.
That's right. Thanks for the plug on that. That's one of our partners, and we do offer travel insurance as an add-on for hotel members who are booking. So it's a pretty good arrangement. Contact us if you need to know more on that.
And it's one of the few that actually would have covered COVID-19 if for those of us who would have had it. In light of the disruption that occurred as of 9/11, where the research shows that it took 2 to 2.5 years where folks felt somewhat comfortable to travel, why are experts thinking that things may return to normal under 2 to 2.5 years with a situation that may be considered worse than 9/11? Wants to answer that one?
I think the short answer is 9/11. What, you know, I think it was more of an economic impact for particularly New Yorkers, which is a huge feeder market into the region, and this is than that. But on the other hand, if there is a second wave this fall and people aren't comfortable traveling as a result of that, it's going to extend all of this. So I think it's just too early to tell right now. I mean, there's an optimistic possibility here that we, at least in the, you know, this part of the hemisphere, I guess, you know, by midsummer, we'll all be back to work and things will at least be under control. Won't be eliminated, but I think people will be back to regular life, and hopefully on into third or fourth quarter, you know, it'll become less newsworthy. And as a result, I think people will be eager to travel. I mean, we could have a tsunami of travel, arguably, next year. So I just think it's too early to tell.
It is, and I'm actually seeing, just as a hotelier, incredible amount of inquiry. I'm not saying it's any more than normal, but a lot of people are just can't wait to get back out there. They're already feeling cooped up and tired of being stuck indoors. So the desire for travel is there. It's whether people will be able to, due to economic and the fear factor as well.
And airlift. Well,
and airlift, exactly. Well, but the airlines don't make money staying on the ground, right? So, yeah.
One comment on that, and I've been speaking to a number of hoteliers about this, and the ones that have impressed me with the most with their plans are those that have talked about coming back in stages, that are telling me that, to link to your comment on air and what Frank just said about air travel, that probably the airlines are not going to come back to the same number of frequencies and routes that they had before this. It's going to come back in stages because they cannot afford to lose money once they start flying again. They're going to be just barely making it to the finish line of this crisis, staying alive. And then when they launch flights again, they cannot lose money on the flights. So they're probably going to have less frequencies, less seats. And that means that for the hotelier, you're going to have to say, all right, let me go through with my best people and do 2 or 3 or 4 cases of opening up my hotel in stages. I can open building A and not building B, or I can open up floors X, Y, and Z and not these other floors. This is how I can bring in my labor force gradually. This is how I can do it, because most of us are used to being open or not being open. And I think a lot of the smartest thinkers are talking about coming back in stages and having a plan for that. And when you sit down with the bank, you're going to need to talk about that too, so that everybody understands this is not just where everybody switches on the switch after a bad nightmare and everything's going to be back to normal. It's going to come back slowly and in stages over time.
Yeah, I think that, and that's a good idea. I think for small hotels, it may be a little bit more difficult for the small hotels and in terms of phasing it in. But definitely, if you could phase in by floor or just a certain block of rooms, then that's the best way. One small hotelier asked about bankruptcy. Oh, did the question just disappear, or did something replace it?
Could I say something on that last point, Sanovnik?
Yeah.
I think we have to also be mindful that in our source markets, the structure of their economies are likely to change as well. As you know, during this time, you're seeing a greater shift towards digital. You know, for some time we were speaking about what the impact of artificial intelligence was going to have on the labor force, but I think a lot of these changes have now come forward, and so the jobs that people had before, some of those jobs are not going to come back, and so people would have to retrain for new opportunities, or so that's what I think we have to be mindful of here. And even in our own economies, the structure of our economies are likely to shift considerably, and that's why it's going to be important for us to assess those changes and then make our adaptive changes in concert with what the new reality is going to be. So it's likely to be a whole new normal when this all subsides.
Which is why when you're doing that forecast, you literally have to revisit it every couple of weeks and at least every month, with new information. There was a small hotelier asking about bankruptcy being an option, albeit an unpalatable one. Can I get panelists' opinion for small hotels with substantial loans? basically using filing for bankruptcy, I suppose. That's the extent of the question, I think. Any take us to that one?
I thought that Matt would jump at that, but I shall take it. I think it depends on your jurisdiction and the laws there and how that works. I can tell you, I worked on a number of cases in Mexico when they had their problems in 94, 95, and they didn't really have a good bankruptcy law at all. And we had to sort of create a virtual bankruptcy. And everything that was done had to go through committees of banks and so forth, and it took an extremely long time. Some countries have been passing bankruptcy laws in the last few years. The Dominican Republic, for example, has a fairly new law that hasn't really been tested. So it would depend on your circumstances. But speaking to the question of small hotels, there are those who suggest that small hotels may have a certain competitive advantage coming back into this, which is that people are not going to want to be in the environment of some of the large hotels. There have been 1,000 plus room hotels built in a number of the largest destinations over the last few years. And there are questions as to whether the consumer is going to feel comfortable in that environment, surrounded by so many people. And so some of the small hoteliers, if they know how to get the message out that this is this is what we are, they may revisit all their visuals, how they're getting the message out. Unfortunately, as Dr. Ram says, there have been so many changes digitally. There are a lot of new ways to get the message out about who you are and what you are, and get in front of people about that. And you may have an advantage you didn't have before about coming back if you're a small hotel.
And that segues, I'm not sure how much more time we have for questions, Shran, because there are like 16 open questions, but one or two. Someone asked, which hotel segment do you feel will have the hardest time rebounding? So I don't know if that, if by extension of your last comment, George and others, if we're saying that it might be the large all-inclusive, so who you think might have the hardest time rebounding?
I think that remains to be seen because we're talking about the psychology of the consumer. Some of these companies are large because they're large and they have extensive financial resources. They have large shareholder bases and they have a lot of expertise, and they probably are quite intelligent and know what they're doing. So whether we can say that the large will suffer more than the small, what I meant to say really was that I think the small have an advantage that they didn't have a while back, and the type of audience they can appeal to and broaden their appeal. But I think it's just really much more a question of case by case and not category by category. And some of the larger companies, they may simply sell a hotel someplace and recapitalize themselves that way. You and I may never hear about that. So things may change hands. Some assets may change hands. Somebody in hotels or 20, 30 may close down one or two or sell one or two and recapitalize themselves that way. So it remains to be seen. I think this is putting a lot of stress on CEOs and a lot of stress on boards of directors to make very smart decisions. And they can't go back and make the decisions over again that they're having to make now. And the largest companies in the world are going through excruciating decisions now on what to do. That the CEO of Marriott almost cried when he was telling his employees that what they were going to have to go through in these coming months. He was being honest about that. So it's a tough environment for the large and the small, but we all have to be very smart and very focused. And again, don't improvise. Improvise will not be well rewarded.
In terms of readiness to travel again, certainly we've got to look at the income situation, and which would seem to indicate that the luxury, the higher end types of properties may be able to come out of this a lot faster than the those that are appealing to 2- and 3-star type of clientele. So that's likely to be a consideration. It depends also what happens to rates as well to appeal to different people. And that message on rates that you gave earlier, George, I think it can't be underscored enough. Being careful not to rush to reduce your rate.
Oh, definitely not. Yeah, I mean, that's the worst thing that we could do right now. There's a really one, I skimmed through, there are a lot of other questions, they're all good. But there's one I just wanted to ask really quickly. Someone asked, is there a program in place to help small to medium hotels who may not have access to financial expertise? I mean, what are some of the things that perhaps, I'm not sure if there are any HTA reps on execs on the call, but I think that that's something we could speak to, Frank, as to what could be done at the HTA or even CHTA level to assist those who don't have the financial expertise to prepare those documents that were recommended.
It's a good point. We're starting some discussion with potential donor agencies that might be able to help us put some technical assistance kinds of things in place. You know, those are things to consider. As associations, local associations, our regional association, we're all impacted because we're supported by the private sector. And as the private sector has income challenges, our associations do as well. So we're trying to be creative right now. We're exploring ways in which we might be able to provide those types of services with support from multilaterals and other types of institutions.
Okay.
Including the Caribbean Development Bank. Okay.
But those services are not really that expensive. I think
Yeah.
relative to the sizes of the loans and so forth. I mean, there are lots of firms out there who do that. We do that kind of thing. It's not impediment, the cost, because of what you're facing, and especially because it's about the hotel situation. Yeah.
And there's more we can do with these types of workshops, going in a little more deeper, maybe a small charge to be able to assess cover some of the costs on it, but certainly there are other ways in which we can provide support. And we're looking at those, Sanovnik.
Yeah, and we would certainly be willing to provide some support. So maybe through the CHTA, Frank, you could get in touch with me back at the bank, and you know, we would provide some TA support for that.
Thank you so much. Okay, Sanovnik, anything else from anybody else? Any closing comments from anyone? We went a little bit over, but I had no problem doing that because I noticed that people were still hanging in there and asking questions. So any final thoughts? Anyone?
Frank, one thing I'd say is there's still a lot of really good questions. Do you think that we could perhaps, you know, once we've closed off, just take any questions that were not answered and perhaps shoot it out to the panelists and at least give them an opportunity to respond in some way? Because there are a lot of really good questions, some questions from indigenous banks, questions about business interruption insurance and so on. So I don't know if we wanted to do that after the fact.
That segues to our closer, which is Vanessa. She's going to give us some closing comments.
Yes, thank you.
And mention what's up next as well. So on behalf of CHTA and our president, Patricia Alfonso Das, who's been on the call as well from Barbados, I'd like to thank each of our panelists. I know you put a bit of time and thinking into it. Just excellent advice throughout the process, and we certainly appreciate it. Vanessa.
Thank you, Frank. And we again want to thank our panelists for joining us today and sharing their insights. The on-demand video recording will be shared with registered attendees within 24 to 48 hours of the webinar, along with questions not answered that were specific to the subject matter. If you want to be added to our database to receive notifications of our webinars, data, and resources, please communicate with us at membership@caribbeanhotelandtourism.com. Our next webinar in the Resilience series is HR Strategies and Solutions to Support Business Continuity. This will be scheduled for late next week, and details will be shared within the next few days. Remember to join the discussion and share other topics you would like us to cover on this series by using the hashtag CHTA Live in our various social platforms. Have a wonderful day.